So, Bill, I understand when you were born, prior to you being born, your father he was involved in a farm?
Well, my father grew up in the Philadelphia area, but after finishing high school, he decided he would like to be a farmer, and he went to a school called National Farm School at Doylestown, Pennsylvania, and after 3 years there of training in farm management and farm operation, he went to work for a company called the John L. King Company that managed farms for wealthy people who needed safe, secure, and professional farm management. And in 1935...
Before we go too far forward, so is that school still exist?
The campus is still there. It's now, the school itself was founded by a rabbi who felt that the Jewish people did not have enough connection to the land, but they accepted non-Jewish students, and my father was able to get into the school. And he trained there, as I said, in farm management.
Did he ever tell you what it was like? I mean, what are the kinds of things they got him doing? Like, for instance, did the school actually have animals?
The school actually had separate farms, and in your second or third year there, you were a student management of one of the farms. One of the stories he told, he said he liked working with draft horses, but he realized that they were not going to be the future, and he became more interested in dairy farming. But whether they milked cows at that farm, I do not know, but he did tell me a little bit about the school. Yeah.
What time period was this, Bill?
This would have been, well, he was born in 1910, so this would have been the late 1920s, early 1930s.
Did that school have electricity, do you know?
The school itself undoubtedly had electricity, I feel certain, yeah.
So Dad left the school at around what age would you call it?
I would say around 20. He was really fairly young to be managing farms, and it's probably the reason he grew a mustache. He had a mustache his entire life. But the interesting part about his employment with the John L. King Company is when the King Company would take over management responsibility for a farm, they would send my father there to manage it until they positioned a married farm manager, and then they would move my father to another farm. And so in a period of 5 or 6 years, he managed farms as far west as Ohio, New Jersey, and in 1934 and 1935, he was managing a farm that was at the intersection of Charles Street and the Baltimore Beltway. A couple of the buildings are still there. It was called Essex Farms, and they bottled and shipped milk, sold milk in the Lutherville area. And my father was not totally happy there. And Philip Augusta Carroll and Nina Rhine Carroll, as owners of the Reagan Manor Farm here in Howard County, had engaged the John L. King Company to assist them with the management of the farm. And Mr. King offered my father the position to come to Reagan Manor, and he accepted that. And in February 1935, a local trucker and cattle dealer named Ed Ballou moved my father from Essex Farm to the farm manager's house on the Reagan Manor. And my father was not yet married.
Okay, but before he gets married, he's in this process of moving to the farm. Did he ever tell you much about why he considered going to this other farm? Was it for instance, example, was it a financial change that was so worthwhile, or did he pick to choose it for other reasons?
Well, I'm not sure I can answer that. There was a milking herd on Duregan Manor. And as I said, the John L. King Company had just taken over Duregan Manor's responsibility for bookkeeping, supplies, and furnishing the manager and possibly other employees on Duregan Manor. And my father was simply not happy with the position at Essex Farms. So he had requested Mr. King to locate him somewhere else. And apparently he didn't want to go too far because he had met my mother in that Towson area, and they were probably engaged about the time that he moved. So that's how come he moved from Lutherville to Duregan Manor.
Gotcha. So let me just get an idea of comparisons now, if you know this. Essex had how much head and how much land?
I really don't know that. I just know that they had a Holstein milking herd, and that they bottled and sold milk in Lutherville.
Do you know where it got distributed?
Pardon?
Where did the milk get distributed?
Lutherville, the community of Lutherville.
They had trucks that drove it around? How did it?
Yes, as a matter of fact, my mother's brother, out of high school, got a job driving one of the milk trucks, and that's how my parents met.
So did they go as far as Timonium or Towson?
Probably a little bit in each direction, yes, yeah.
So now he moves with the help of a guy that had a tractor trailer.
Well, probably not a tractor trailer. Ed Ballou was a long-time resident across Frederick Road from Duregan Manor, and he was a cattle dealer and trucker. But my father told me he came to Essex Farms, the Carrolls sent him to Essex Farm to get my father's furniture and move him to Duregan Manor, February of 1935.
So Mr. Ed Ballou also used to have some buffalo down in his pasture.
That is correct, yeah.
So at that time, how much herd did he accept to manage, and how much land did he accept to manage?
Well, Duregan Manor, when it was a full-fledged tobacco plantation, was about 12,500 acres. And it stayed that intact from when it was a land grant in early 1700s until about 1866, when it got divided among quite a few members of the Carroll family. And Philip Augusta Carroll, a descendant of the signer of the Declaration of Independence, acquired the farm sometime in the 1920s from his nephew. So it's never been out of the Carroll family. But Philip Carroll himself did not inherit the 2,500 acres that comprised the land area that my father had to manage.
And he didn't manage that by himself, did he?
No, that's why this farm was quite a bit different from your average Howard County farm that was family owned and operated.
Why was it different?
Well, the size of it mandated a great many more employees than the average farm. And the owner, Philip Augusta Carroll, was this was his ancestral home where he grew up. He was the youngest son of Governor John Lee Carroll that died in 1911, and Philip Carroll's older brother took over the farm in 1911, and what was interesting there is that from verbal history that the longtime black employees on the manor told me that from 1911 to in the 1920s, the Charles Carroll Senior, two father and son named Charles Carroll owned and operated, and at that time they had a purebred milking shorthorn herd. I think it's during their ownership that the large bank barn that housed, had 75 milking stanchions in one big bank barn, that was undoubtedly constructed in 1911 to 1920 something, when Philip Augusta acquired it from his nephew. And the milking shorthorn herd had been dispersed, but the longtime employees told me that at that era, the Carrolls wanted everything very fancy. They had fancy fowl chicken houses, they had imported Percheron horses, and the milking shorthorns, some of them may have been imported, because I remember in the manor house there was a large oil painting of a shorthorn bull named Comet, big oil painting. That was the kind of operation, and it probably lost considerable money. And when Philip Augusta Carroll took over the property, he sort of took the reverse. He wanted my father to operate it very efficiently. He didn't want to lose money, and he wanted to keep all of the employees working. Of course, this was the height of the Depression, 1935, and my father was to keep the employees working. But for instance, my father wanted a Guernsey herd. What type of cattle they were milking when he moved there, I don't know, because that preceded me. But he told me that he could only buy purebred Guernseys when he could get them about the same price as grade Guernseys, because Mr. Carroll did not want this lavish expenditure. So my father had a very tight budget in acquiring the purebred cattle, and
Okay, this is good.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you a question about your...
Did the Carrolls have any association with the Holstein purebreds at Dunlogan?
No. When my first memory on Duregan Manor, the Guernsey milk was being sold to Dunlogan. Dunlogan bottled their own milk, but they also bought milk from other Howard County farmers. And Duregan Manor hauled their cans of milk the 4 or 5 miles down Frederick Road and delivered it at Dunlogan. So one of my very early memories as being 5 years old was my father would let me ride in the truck to Dunlogan, and I was fascinated with that milk bottling equipment, because I would get up to the window, and while they were waiting to dump the milk and get the wash cans and go back, and I'd sort of hang out there until somebody would bring me a pint of chocolate milk.
So you're saying that was kind of a big commercial operation?
Well, Dunlogan bottled their own milk and bought milk from others besides the Holstein herd. But I became a little more acquainted with the Dunlogan history but later in life. I started the 7th grade. I went to McDonough School, which had in Baltimore County, which had a registered Holstein herd. And Richard Wills, that managed that McDonough School herd, was very close to the Dunlogan farm and breeding, and had bought a herd sire and some females in the Dunlogan dispersal in 1943. But Paul Meisner was the manager of Dunlogan, and his reputation exists among Holstein breeders today. And Mr. Wills said that Paul Meisner's success in running Dunlogan was that Philip Natwick, that owned it, gave him a free hand in picking the breeding stock and developing that famous herd. And I have one of the catalogs from the 1943 dispersal of the Dunlogan herd.
What size was the herd around then?
Pardon?
What size was the herd around then? When you were the youngest you can remember, or
At Dunlogan?
Yeah.
I suspect that they didn't milk a lot of cows. I don't know, they may have had several, well, you know, at that era, a 40-cow stanchion barn was a typical maximum, I think, that farms had. Whether they milked more than 40 cows themselves, I really don't know.
Yeah, we're going to be talking to Charlie Yeager, so we'll find out.
Yeah, okay.
Where was the milking, not the milking, the processing plant?
Processing plant was like right contiguous to the barns, and of course there was no pipeline milking then, so cans of the milk would have been hand carried from the milking barn into their refrigeration at their milk plant. And I don't really recall the milking, the dumping, where the cans were dumped, and how that, I don't remember how that part of the Dunlogan was operating, but I do know that other farmers also delivered their milk there, not just Reagan Manor.
Oh, so there was a steady stream of trucks coming in.
Yeah.
So so it sounds like your earliest memories are when you were 5. So let's go back to 5 and tell me more of those memories of what the farm was like when you were 5.
Well,
You remember.
I'm going to jump back to something else my father told me. He said in February of 1935, when he arrived there, what the farmhands on DeRegan were doing was cutting ice off of the ice pond. So this was pretty much a self-sufficient farming operation. And housing for employees, and in my memory, I don't remember them cutting ice. So I'm assuming that 1935 or several years after that was the last time that they cut and stored their own ice in the ice house.
Was the ice house a pit?
The ice house and the smokehouse are two appendage buildings at the manor house itself. On the end of the house opposite the chapel was a sizable smokehouse and a ice house. I don't know how deep it was, but as a child you opened the door and looked down there. I would guess probably 20 feet in the ground to put the ice in there and pack straw around the blocks that you cut so they didn't freeze together. And much later, I would say in the maybe mid-1960s, Philip Augusta Carroll's son, also Philip Carroll, filled half of the ice house in so it would be more convenient to use it for a root cellar. You could just have a short ladder to go down and store vegetables in, as a root cellar instead of an ice house.
So it sounds like there was some growing on the farm then?
Park.
Sounds like there was some growing going on in the farm?
Well, yeah, there was plenty of growing. My father was very much interested in soil conservation, and he got the Soil Conservation Service in there early on and put a lot of terracing in because the tobacco and wheat cropping, and then over history, managers were rated on how much they could produce and whether they didn't not put enough back into the soil, and there was quite a bit of erosion. So the terraces were put in, and we had a number of soil conservation tours coming into the farm to show other farmers the benefit of contour, farming on the contour, and using grass terraceways in between the cropland. But for a period of time in my early memory, my father went almost to total grassland farming. The dairy herd was pastured, of course, day and night, except in the wintertime at night maybe the cows would be left in on cold nights. But they also developed a Angus herd that utilized a lot of pasture. I do remember early corn silage making. They had a binder, they had some tractors. They had, my early memory of the draft horse stable was 7 teams of draft horses. And gradually, of course, the draft horses phased out and more tractors were purchased.
What were the draft horses mainly used for?
The draft horses originally, of course, were used for all farm labor, farm operation, but I do not recall them being used for plowing. The tractors had taken over the heavy work of plowing, but the horses were used for hay raking. They were used for cultivating corn. They were used for planting corn. They were used for pulling a grain drill. Those were the primary uses.
Did you ever have a chance to see your father using them?
See my father using them?
Yeah.
No, with the responsibilities of running that farm, it was not very often that he did a lot of the actual field work. Not very often.
What did you see him doing in those days when you were You must have said, I'm watching my dad, what's he doing? What did you observe your dad doing? Giving out a lot of commands? Or?
Well, what I observed was how he took responsibility for supervising the dairy cows, checking on heifers grazing in various fields that every day he would go count them and make sure they were all in good health. He had supervision of a large garden and orchard on the property. There was a riding horse stable with a full-time employee, Jim Caldwell, for the first, from my early memory until about 1955 or so, a riding stable for the Carroll family of 7 or 8 riding horses. They had an annual Durango Manor Horse Show every May for the benefit of the Carroll County Health Department. That was a traditional event that interrupted the farming operation because fencing for the horse show ring had to be put up every year and then taken down. And
it was like a steeplechase.
Well, yes, yeah, it was a horse show with jumps and riding classes, all types of classes. But the women's auxiliary of the Howard County Health Department, had booths to sell food, and all the profit went to the county health department.
Bill, how many people did your father supervise on the farm, and how did the blacks fit in with the farming operation?
Well, the farm complex, the main farm complex, is about a quarter of a mile east of the manor house itself. And the manager's house was in the center of that group of a very fine home that was a great place for me to grow up. But that farm complex included another 10 tenant dwellings, some of which were original slave quarters, and some of which had been built and were more modern. And under my father, there was a herdsman, and normally the herdsman lived in a brick house that was originally built about the time of the Revolution as a workhouse for weaving cloth for the slave population. But the second floor of that was the herdsman's home, and Herman Bendig was a long-time herdsman on Duregan Manor at the time when they milked 100 cows in the 1940s. All through the war, they were milking about 100 cows in 2 barns there at the main quarters. And the other houses, some of which were slave quarters. One was still a log cabin slave quarter that a family, Ollie Jones, lived in. And about half of the houses had running water and electricity during the war, and the other half did not. And normally, the employees that milked the cows had the houses with the electricity and running water. And the other houses did not, but then after the war, gradually they provided running water and electricity to all of the rest of the houses.
So how many people are we talking about being supervised?
Well, we're probably talking about 12 employees year-round, and you're picking up 5 or 6 more every summer because the field work that, and also high school boys really looked for farm employment in those days. My father had an unusual policy. If a young person, either the black families or the white families or myself, if they wanted to work on the farm, the pay scale was a nickel an hour for each year of your age. So you had to get up to 20 years old before you could get $1 an hour. And that's where it started. And to tell you some of the early memories and talking about using horses, when they filled silo, and this milking operation then, they did put up corn silage, had 3 wooden silos, probably 12 by 30 feet or 12 by 40 feet. Today you'd fill one of those in an hour maybe, but of course then the corn was cut with a binder that tied the bundles of corn and dropped them on the ground, and the farm had 2 trucks. Now I'm talking during the war era, which of course early part of my memory. But the field hands that are out there in the field picking up these bundles of corn, putting them on a truck that's then coming into the chopper blower and dropping the stalks on the table that feeds them into the blower and up the silo. They never wanted to not be able to, they didn't want the people in the field waiting for a truck. They had to keep them busy. So one of my young black friends, a couple years older than me, had an affinity for driving the horses, and he'd have a team of horses and a wagon with a rack on the back of the wagon, and when there was no truck in the field, then he'd drive the horses up to where the men were picking the bundles of corn up, and they'd put some on the wagon until a truck showed up, and then he would drive off to the side of the field. I remember being out there one day when Ollie Jr. was driving, and George Jones, a cousin, both of these boys about 4 years older than me, they got a little, tired of just waiting in the field because trucks were coming pretty regularly. So they tied a rope from the top of the rope that held the bundles of corn down was tied from the top of the rack to the front of the wagon. Well, they decided to see if the horse could pull a corn root out of the ground. Well, I'll tell you, corn roots are pretty hard in the ground, and they tied this to the corn root and told the horses to pull, and snapped one of the oak beams that supported the back rack, and oh, were they upset. What was going to happen to them for that, fooling around like that?
So we've got the main house, and then we've got your house, and then we've got quite a ways to get down to all the processing and buildings that are housed by the helpers and all that stuff. So when you were young, did you decide you were going to spend the day walking down to the main farm buildings, or what did you do when you were young? Like, did you start to get interested in farming then, or what?
Oh yes, I had a garden, and 4-H showing a Guernsey heifer was, they allowed me to, well, I think my first memory with working with the cattle, they let me raise a bull calf in the shed of the backyard of my house. And I would go get a bottle of milk from Herman Bendig when all the other calves were being fed, and take the bottle and nipple and feed it to this bull calf. And then the next year, I guess it progressed. They're going to let me feed a group of heifers in the closest little heifer pasture. I'm guessing less than a quarter of a mile from the top of the bank barn where they had a grain room. And I had one of a pretty nice, heavy, a little better than an ordinary child's pull wagon, wooden pull wagon, and Herman Bendig would lead, in the morning he'd have 2 part bags, because I couldn't lift 100 pounds anywhere close, and I would pull that wagon out to the wooden feed box in the heifer pasture and dump the grain in, and count the heifers. And I wasn't too knowledgeable about telling whether any of them were in any. I don't recall having any sickness problem during that summer. The year I was 13.
Before we get to 13.
Okay.
It's like that, we're jumping a bit there.
Bill, you were young during the Second World War, but
Yeah.
do you remember German prisoners?
Absolutely, no question about that. That was one of the things I thought about when you asked me to participate in this. The prisoners came up from Fort Meade to the freezer locker co-op at St. John's and Frederick Road, and the farmers went there and picked them up. And they picking up these corn binder bundles in the field, of course, was one of the jobs where you needed the most people. And then handling hay bales, that was always, all summer long, was hay and straw handling, which required a lot of help. Well, the manor had used enough of the German prisoners that they sent a guard with the group that came to Duregan Manor, whereas I know other families would just have one prisoner and they'd get the same prisoner every day, and there was no security on those individual farms. But at Duregan, that was memorable, that these German prisoners, I can't remember the exact number, but they must have had, I'm saying, at least a half dozen that they would have because of the guard. And I remember one story. I'd get the stories from that would, if I wasn't out in the field and around the farm, you would, hear plenty of talk. The guard didn't have a whole lot of responsibility. These prisoners were probably a whole lot happier to be out there on the farm and getting a meal in the middle of the day than they were being down there in the, in the prison. And a tractor or a truck almost ran over the guard because he was sleeping in the grass on a terrace, and and somebody almost ran over him with a farm vehicle. But
How did they eat during the day?
well, when I said that, I don't know whether they brought food with them or whether the farm furnished it. I have no recollection I wasn't around the prisoners that much. But since you've brought that up, was another interesting farm-related employee situation that is probably what led to me going to McDonough School, which was a boarding school. At the beginning of the war, the headmaster at McDonough School, Doc Lamborn, conceived of an idea of providing farm labor by training city boys at McDonough School to then go work on farms. And they must have advertised in the Baltimore Sun or something like that, but this was run by the headmaster and Richard N. Wills, who I mentioned with his connection to Dunlogan. When school was out and the students went home, here comes a large group from Baltimore City, I'm guessing like, high school juniors or seniors that haven't been drafted yet, and McDonough gives them a crash course in how to work on a farm, and then they did not have enough farmers who wanted to take all of these young men. And Richard Wills, I guess, had gotten to know my father when he was at Essex Farms, and they came to Duregan Manor and asked if Duregan would take a group. And this brick house I'm talking about that was originally built as a workhouse, and the herdsmen lived on the second floor, but the first floor was divided into about 5 rooms that could be used for a family, but we were calling it the bunkhouse because single employees that would come and work could have a room in there, and there was a kitchen and a bathroom and a shower. Well, Duregan Manor took a group of these young men, and my sister and I, she's a year younger than me. I'm 6, I guess, that year, or 7. And we remembered very well that they were there all summer and worked on the farm. And of course, if they were juniors in high school, they had another year, but I think most of them went in one of the services when that summer was over. And I know the manor hired a cook to feed them in the bunkhouse, and a few of them after the war came back to visit, but we never kept any permanent connection with them.
I assume that there was a certain amount of skepticism taking these young boys, because unless boys have changed, they can get rowdy.
Yes, yeah.
Burn the place down.
And of course, at the age I wasn't out there working on the farm with them, but one of the longtime black farm employees, Joseph Jones, known all his life as Biggie, said, he said to me once later, he said, they were good workers, they were pretty good, But one job they couldn't stand, and I think Biggie and I were probably doing that job together, and that was when you dumped barley into a big grain bin and it had a little too much moisture in it, you actually, to keep it from molding, went up there with shovels in this granary with the hot grain and a low roof, and you took shovels and you turned it and worked your way through the pile of barley to keep it from spoiling. And Biggie said, boy, they couldn't do that though. That was a little too much for them.
Why was it too much? The odor?
I'm thinking just the continuous lifting of shovelfuls of heavy grain and the heat, you know, the heat of the confined granary. Yeah.
It sounds like Biggie might have been a pretty important mentor to you when you were starting to learn about the farm. Did Biggie help you a lot in learning about stuff?
Well, I had a lot of mentors, which I think is what's wrong with society today. When you think about, now you asked me the number of employees, I remember taking family inventory. I take population inventory one time. There were 75 people living on Duregan Manor. And that was probably a fairly constant number. But not only, I mentioned Herman Bendig, who was an outstanding herdsman, and he had a son, Eugene, a year younger than me, 5 years younger than me. I was 5 when Eugene was born. We became partners in 1976 when I moved to Carroll County, and we bought a farm together and farmed together.
Let's try to concentrate on the other mentors before we go on to Eugene.
Yes.
I'll be asking you about Eugene later.
Harry Atfelt came to Duregan Manor shortly after my father, but he grew up on Duregan Manor. His father was a German immigrant that worked on the farm that became Brendel's Manor. He worked for the St. Charles College, which was across Frederick Road from the Duregan Manor farm. And then when the college burned, Harry Atfelt's father moved to an isolated stone granite house away from the main buildings of the farm, and I'm told he farmed there with oxen. But Harry Atfelt had left farming and was working for the gas and electric company when he got an injury, and they let him go, and he came to Duregan Manor and worked as a farm foreman under my father. In other words, he supervised the outside crew of workers. And I was always interested in mechanics. Harry was an excellent mechanic. I remember when when I'd get off of the school bus came in Manor Lane to the main buildings, and we all went to West Friendship Elementary. But my first memory of Harry Atfelt was he was, during the winter in the farm shop, he was rebuilding a Frick sawmill, a used Frick sawmill that my father had purchased for Duregan Manor. And Harry did all the mechanical work. He supervised the men. My father was very well organized. He and Harry Atfelt met at 7:15 every morning in the farm office and discussed everybody's work assignment, and my father would find out what Harry needed in the way of tools and supplies, and then Harry would assign the men to their work and actually supervise them. But I learned a lot from him about mechanics and how much work they did during the war and shortly after the war with very small tractor machinery compared to what we do today, and how they got that much work done really required organization. But you mentioned the black families. I was very close to them also. I think, yes, I learned from them. Biggie not only did farm work, and I worked with him a couple years when he ran the first self-propelled combine that we got, which was probably about 1954, and my father ran it for the first or second year when it was new, and then Biggie ran it for a year or two, and I hauled all the barley, which I really hated. Barley has a dust to it that makes you itch. Combines did not have a air-conditioned cab. Maybe somebody had an air-conditioned cab, but the International Combine that we had, you sat right above the reel, and all that dust came off of the reel, and it's a wonder we didn't get black lung disease until. Biggie helped train me in tractor operation, and but then he had other skills. He did all the plumbing on the farm at that time, and he did masonry work also because they sawed their own lumber, built their own buildings. I mentioned a log cabin, slave quarter log cabin that was in terrible condition, and the Jones brother, who was the Carroll chauffeur, lived there, Ollie Jones Sr., and that needed replacing. After the war, they sold barracks from Fort Meade on bid, and Duregan Manor bid on one of the barracks, and the farm workers in the off season got in the farm trucks and went down to Fort Meade. I never went with them. Took down the barracks and brought it back and used the lumber to build a new tenant house for Ollie, and used field stone that's picked off of the fields to build the basement foundation and the lumber and window frames and siding from a Fort Meade barrack. Built a new tenant house, probably about 1950, thereabouts. And
so Bill, during this time when you were 5, 6, 7, 8, do you remember much what your mom was doing on the farm?
She due to the nature of which this farm was operated, it was not a family farm operation. So my mother was involved to the extent that answering the telephone, occasionally going to pick up machinery parts at Clark and Owens in Ellicott City, and she did a fair amount of canning during the war, and just running the household.
Well, sometimes they say, Bill, behind every great man is a great woman. Do you have any experiences about how your mom and your dad related about the farm? What was that like?
Well, I think my father probably discussed any serious problems and concerns, particularly dealing with employees, but they didn't do that with the children around. There was we weren't privy to discussions that took place involving management of the farm between my parents.
That's good. How many? I never get the idea of how many siblings do you have?
My sister and I, and a brother who was 5 years younger than me.
And your sister's younger or older than you?
My sister's 1 year younger.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So the three of you were living in this house. Did your your dad and your mom and you guys had your own house?
Oh, yes, yeah.
And so then there was this very fancy Carroll House, mansion, very, whatever, large building nearby?
Well, the manor house was
Manor house.
the manor house was built in 1717 by the second owner. The first owner they were all Charles Carroll, and only historians are putting Roman numerals after them to keep track of them, but the Carroll family tracked them by Charles Carroll, the settler, who actually acquired the property, but not too long before his death. So Charles Carroll of Annapolis took ownership sometime between 1710 and 1727, which is the date that's normally put on the construction of the manor house. Now, the original house was a story and a half, and it had a private chapel on one end of it and a separate kitchen on the other side. And it stayed that way until 1832. But the most famous owner, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, took the name Carrollton from another property in Frederick County, which the Carroll family never lived on. Charles Carroll of Carrollton lived in Annapolis during the Revolution. His father was living at Duregan. I can't remember the father's exact death date, but it's about 1780, and then Charles Carroll of Carrollton lived there the rest of his life. And he died in 1832 at age 95, the last living signer of the Declaration of Independence, and he's buried under the floor of the chapel where there's no basement. He was buried in the earth under the floor of the chapel. But about the time of his death, the farm, almost the entire 12,500 acres, went to a grandson because the only son of Charles Carroll of Carrollton, the signer, died before the signer did, signer living to age 95. The manor house was then elevated to a full 2 stories, and the kitchen wing and the chapel were also elevated and all connected together. So it was, counting the woodshed on the south end, it's a total of 300 feet from the chapel to the woodshed, and the kitchen wing had servants' quarters above it, and the house is essentially like a story and a half wide. The central hall has doors opening on both the east and west side of the house, and they always maintained a large vegetable garden. There was a commercial orchard when my father came to Duregan, but I think it was at the last stages of its commercial productive life, and they replanted a smaller orchard just for farm and family use, and converted the original large orchard to pasture. But my first full-time summer job, my father thought I could handle the bagging of the barley on a combine. Alice Chalmers combine probably had a 5-foot sickle bar and a platform in which somebody had to ride, and as the combine harvested the barley, it came up an elevator, and you had 2 chutes, and you had 2 bags hanging there, and somebody had to flip a lever from one bag to the other, and you tied the bags and let them slide down a chute onto the ground. And Biggie was the one running the combine with a Farmall M tractor, and I'm 13, and we're out there in what I thought was a tremendous yield barley field, and I could not handle the job. The grain was coming in faster than I could tie and unhook bags, and what made it more complicated, the platform wasn't all that big, and I guess the chute had a chain that you could vary the pitch of it. To keep bags from being scattered all over the field, I was told you have to accumulate 3 or 4 bags on this platform and then drop them as a group. Well, while I'm trying to drop bags, grain's running off of the chute and overfilling a bag, and to tell the truth, I don't think today I can yet tie a miller's knot. I had a tough time with that. With the knot I was supposed to use on these burlap bags. So there was a fellow probably in his 20s that lived on the farm and had been assigned to help with the manor house grounds and garden. They had a full-time garden employee.
This is your next job we're talking about?
I'm talking about the summer when I'm 13. They said,
we didn't know how much you were making on that combine job.
well, I'm 13, so at 5 cents,
It's still the same
5 cents an hour for each year of my age. I can't do that math in my head. That it'd be 50 cents an hour at age 10, so what I'd be 65 cents an hour. I'm out there.
Okay.
Well, there was a fellow who I don't know why he wasn't, let's say, doing regular full-time farm work, but they needed extra help during the summer with the manor house grounds and garden. So I can't remember his name, but he was well out of school, and his family, he wasn't, he was a single fellow living with other family members, as I remember, and they put him into farm work for the summer instead of the manor house, and I got the job of mowing the manor house lawn. And the total grounds that the manor house took up, including roadsides leading up to the house and the front and back lawn, a total of 12 acres, including the garden. And it took me it was a motor-powered reel-type lawnmower with a little sulky behind it, so I didn't have to walk. But it cut such a little bit of grass at a time. I started on a Monday morning, and it took me till noon on Thursday to mow all the grass. But that did include that if the gardener had a lot of picking to do, like I remember particularly the strawberry bed, he would come get me off of the mower, and he'd say, they want to put up strawberry preserves in the kitchen, and we need to get the strawberries picked. Get out here with me. That was Frank Hansen was the gardener at that time, and another mentor, because he had a greenhouse that he kept running year-round. They grew their own plants for the garden. They had grapes. Biggie made wine. There was another thing. Every Christmas, the carols, we would get my parents would get a Christmas basket that had a couple bottles of wine labeled Manor Wine that they put up some every fall. Well, you can see how Biggie and Ollie and the other brother, Leroy Jones, who in my very early years took care of all the draft horses. He was in charge of the draft horse stable. And my sister and I, again, about the same year that I would occasionally go to Dunlogan on the milk delivery run. My sister and I liked to go to the draft horse stable before breakfast, and Mr. Leroy would let us put ears of corn in the feed boxes before they got the horses out and harnessed them for whatever work they were doing with them.
Who do you think your mentor was in actually learning the farm equipment? Did you get a chance to learn the farm equipment? And who helped you? We know you were good at pulling a wagon.
Well, you know, you mentioned working with my father. When they bought this, there was a pretty big deal when they bought a self-propelled combine. And again, I'm guessing a little bit, maybe 1952, between 1950 and 1952. My father ran it the first 2 years. My father only had one eye. You can't do depth perception very well with one eye, and you're sitting on this combine trying to cut the straw as close to the ground as possible without hitting the straw. It must hitting the ground must have been pretty tough on him, but then he would have shown me how to do that. But other field work was trained by, well, sometimes Biggie, sometimes Leroy Jones, and Harry F. felt most likely, particularly the mechanical part.
Did you have a desire to drive a tractor?
Pardon?
Did you have a desire to drive a tractor?
Oh, yes, yeah, of course.
Tell me some things about that.
How big were the tractors?
Well, the manor had 3 Farmall M's. By the end of the war, they had 3 M's, an H, and a C. And the Farmall C did the mowing and raking. It had a side-mounted mower. No, it would have been a rear-mounted. Then it had a rear-mounted mower on the Farmall M. I know one of my memories is a particular field that where the name Heater Field came from, I have no idea, but there was a big heifer field they called the Heater Field. And I think a lot of the grass must have been bluegrass. It had a very fine, thick grass in this pasture. And I was, I guess, like we'd finished doing the barley where I was, before I was running the combine, I drove the trucks and unloaded the barley into the elevator that put it in the granary. They sent me to mow this Heater Field pasture. So when you let your foot off the clutch, the tractor went forward at the same time that the sickle bar started to work. All the new tractors, you can start your implement before you start the motion. Well, I would get that tractor, that sickle bar blade choked up, and I'd have to back up, raise the blade with a hand lever, get off, and get the grass out between the teeth and the sickle bar. And so I was on that job for a couple days, and I remember it was Biggie that looked at that mower and he said, "Boy, no wonder you're having trouble. That blade is dull as it can be." So you learn by experience. You learn by experience, but nobody was supervising me close enough. They gave me a tractor with a mower attached to the rear of it and a dull knife, and I was just doing the best I could.
Farming, Bill, sometimes farming can be slightly dangerous. Do you remember any injuries in those days?
We were very fortunate, and I really say this, some narrow escapes, injuries, two things pop into my mind. One was, I mentioned a man named Stuart Fox operated a 120 cow Angus cow-calf operation on the south end of the 2,500 acre block that my father managed. And Stuart Fox had the oldest tractor. They had a very old case tractor that was undoubtedly there when my father came there in 1935, but it did have rubber. It was rubber tire. It's the first tractor that I drove on the farm, and it was Stuart Fox then that helped me, was my mentor in that hay field. They were putting up hay with a what you call a hay rake that picked the hay up and elevated it up, and then it dropped on a wagon that was attached to the mechanism that picked it up. And it was being pulled by this case tractor, which had like 3 forward gears, which were slow, quite slow, and very slow. But those were tractors in those days. And I wasn't strong enough to turn the rig around, so I would go down the field, and then Stuart Fox and Walker Johnson, another longtime black employee on the manor, would get off. I would put the tractor in neutral, and Stuart would turn it around, and then he'd get back on the wagon, and I would start the tractor up again. Well, Stuart had a big old hay baler, and that tractor, the manor had bought a new baler, and Harry Atfeld had a newer tractor, I think an International 300, but they kept the old baler. And Stuart was due to get that baler back to the farm headquarters at the end of the workday. And Harry Atfeld didn't like to close up until everything was secure. And I don't recall what I had done that day, and I may not have even been working on the farm, but I was maybe, you know, again, guessing a little bit, mid-1950s. And Stuart didn't show up, and he didn't show up, so they decided to take a farm truck and drive south on Manor Lane and see what had happened. And Manor Lane had eroded and created a large ditch off to one side. In several places they had moved the dirt road and left the ditch there. A tie rod on that tractor had broken loose, and the tractor had gone down into this sizable gully, and the hand lever that you raised and lowered the pickup on the baler with had come down right over that iron seat. Stuart Fox had the presence to crawl up on the front of the tractor as that thing went down with this big old baler behind it. And so fortunately, he wasn't hurt. But an employee on the Reagan Manor when I was growing up, and then later when I was managing the farm, he came back as an older man and worked with me, but he was a long-time black farm worker, well known throughout Howard County. Jess Johnson had one arm, and he could not only he did tractor work, he loved farming. I remember as a kid, of course, the uniqueness of seeing this one-armed man, but not only did he do tractor work that required working mechanical levers, and when you didn't have hydraulic cylinders, but he would carry a rifle with him to shoot a rabbit or a groundhog or something. He lived on his own property on Centennial Lane, and commuted back and forth to the manor, didn't live on Reagan Manor. And years later, when I asked Jess how he lost that arm, he said, I was a smart aleck. We're filling the silo with a steam traction engine, which I recall until that was operating on the manor till I was maybe 5 or 6 years old. The steam traction engine is running the silage blower, and Jess is working there, And he told me at the end of the day, instead of shutting the tractor down and moving it forward to take pressure off of the belt, he had the habit of grabbing the belt and jerking it, and it would come off of the pulley, and that would be the end of the day. Well, he grabbed the belt too close to the pulley, and his arm went between the belt and the pulley, and he lost his arm. That would have been before Philip Augusta Carroll's ownership. I mean, Jess would have been born probably about 1910, and he would have been working maybe in his early teens or mid-teens when he was doing that. And he told me that, I don't know where they took him, whether to a doctor's office or all the way to Baltimore, but they had a Model T station wagon, and they took him to save him. And I guess they obviously amputated the arm because he was too destroyed to save in that day. Maybe today's medicine might have saved him. He said the Carrolls offered to give him an education or to get him more education. He was not literate. He signed his checks, Jess, his mark, Johnson. I would write on the check and put brackets around it, and then he'd put his X in the bracket. When he was working for me, much later when I was
What happened to your dad's
in my
eye?
30s, huh?
What happened to your dad's eye?
My father retired, and I don't remember years real well, but my father retired about 1972. He had a defective heart condition his entire life, and he and my mother had built their own home in Talbot County on the Eastern Shore and used it for weekend vacations for a number of years before he retired. And he died of a heart attack about a year after he retired.
What about his eye? Did you say he had an eye?
He lost an eye in a childhood accident. He never told me which brother. His family, he had 3 brothers. There were 4 boys in his family, and they were playing cowboys and Indians, and one of his brothers shot an arrow into a dark shed and hit him in the eye. And Johns Hopkins eye surgeon that he went to regularly told him that he thought he could save that eye. Well, I have an eye problem, and I understand now what my father did was he had a distorted image in that eye, and his brain learned to just see out of one eye. And it developed a cataract in the defective eye, and that irritated enough that that it caused him to start seeing the distorted image. And he went to Hopkins and had surgery on it about 1951, 52, and apparently the surgery was successful. He was supposed to be more or less motionless for a period of time. At any rate, between the end of the surgery, within a day or so, they took the bandage off and the eye had hemorrhaged. And after that, he wore a clouded lens over the, he had a false eye, but basically he preferred to just use a clouded lens on his eyeglasses. But there's a lot of things that are hard to do with one eye. My father was very patriotic. He was in the, they had Minutemen in the county. And he did train with what they called the Minutemen, but he, even though he could have gotten a farm deferment, he probably, I'm thinking, probably would have gone in the service if he had been eligible.
So your teen years went by, and you did a lot of farming work, and you told me you were influenced or met a guy named Eugene, and you and Eugene might have gotten some kind of an adventure together yourselves?
Well, we operated a dairy farm together.
How did that start out?
Well, it started out in this manner. When Dunlogan farm went out of the dairy business, the Reagan Manor joined the Maryland Milk Producers Co-op, and our Guernsey milk went by can to Cloverland Dairy in Baltimore and was marketed as Golden Guernsey milk. And you got a premium for that Golden Guernsey label. That was a national label developed by the Guernsey Breed Association. And the health department, sometime about the end of the war, got very fussy about labeling a Guernsey product if you couldn't be sure that the milk was all coming from Guernsey cows. So they said the herds that are using this label have to be purebred Guernseys. And the Manor herd was about half and half. And my father had another idea, and that was to utilize the land and the property more efficiently and not have everybody be hired labor. They would build another dairy operation on Carroll's Mill Road where there was a house and just an old dilapidated barn. And they built one of the first milking parlors in the area. It was a 4-stall milking parlor with 2 milking machines. They got the first milk tanks. They had milk tanks made by the A.E. Kaesner Company in Baltimore, and we had milk tanks at the new dairy operation, it built in 1947, and the main herd, and they had to use a pump to put the milk from the tank to the cans to get it to Cloverland until a milk pickup tank truck route was developed. So my father was a pioneer in many aspects of farming, and going to the bulk tanks was part of it, but I digress because when the other dairy operation was built, they moved the grade Guernseys to that operation and developed a share the profit operation so that an individual would operate a certain amount of land and take care of this 35 to 40 cow dairy herd in a loafing barn, one of the first total loafing barn operations, and a 4-stall milking parlor. I think I was told that Reds Adams at Clarksville was building a milking parlor at the same time that the Manor was building this Mill Road milking parlor. Well, my father had 2 or 3 different operators of that Mill Road dairy operation did not work out very well. And my father then hired a Dutch immigrant, Henry Van Lieshout, but he paid him a salary just to operate that dairy operation, separate from the main herd. And when I was finishing my dairy science degree at University of Maryland College Park, I didn't have any money. I owned 3 cows from my 4-H projects, and somehow I wanted to get into farming. And my father said, well, I thought you might take over that Mill Road farm operation. So January 1st, 1959, I took over operating that separate herd on a share of the profit. The Carrolls had a problem with actually cash renting because Philip Augusta Carroll had, as an international attorney, he specialized in international law, and he knew that countries had, the politics of some countries had demanded that tenants be allowed to buy the land that they were tenants on, whether these were South American or European land, land policy terms, and they didn't want the legal term rent on a contract. So this was a share of the profit with no wording as landlord and tenant. But when I started there, I'd say Eugene Bendig, I came as my employee, and eventually we developed a working partnership where, and gradually I was able to buy the herd of cows myself. So, and then in 1971, my wife and I decided if we were ever going to own a farm of our own, we had to be looking around and trying to find something, and we thought that land was too expensive in this area. And when we bought a farm on the Eastern Shore at a very low price for 1972, we actually did that as a partnership with the Bendigs also, because we used the income from our cows to help pay the mortgage on that farm. But we never moved to that farm. We sold it in order to buy a farm in Carroll County that already had a walk-in dairy operation on it. So instead of having to build a dairy operation on the Eastern Shore, 1976, at age 40, I left the Reagan Manor, I think in good graces with the Carroll family, and Eugene Bendig and I went, and eventually we separated when both of our children wanted to be involved in the farming, his son and my son. We separated our partnership, and the Bendigs bought a farm in Pennsylvania where Gene's son has made a tremendous reputation as a purebred dairy herdsman. So Eugene's now deceased, but there's 3 generations of almost like an inherited ability to understand and work with dairy cattle. Certainly Gene's father and Gene had more inherent natural ability for understanding and working with dairy cattle than I did. I think, truth be told, I was probably more interested in the mechanical and carpentry and construction aspects on the Reagan Manor, but I also very much interested in the dairy also, and then was a full-time dairyman for 30 years of my life.
30 years?
I'm thinking from when I was 20 till I was 50, I changed careers at age 50 and worked for 20 couple years for Carroll County government managing their farmland preservation program in the county.
Do you keep in touch with the Carrolls today?
I would say no. No, I have not. I don't have a relationship with the current owners. I did keep up with Philip Carroll, deceased, when did he die? 8 or 9 years ago, I guess. I've not kept track of how many years ago Philip Carroll died.
Who are the current owners?
Pardon?
Who are the current owners of the manor property?
Well, Philip Augusta Carroll's wife, Nina Ryan Carroll, was quite a bit younger than Philip Augusta, and Philip Augusta Carroll died about 1958, between 56 and 58, I can't remember for sure, but his wife lived until 1989, and at her death, the 2,500 acre was divided between Philip, the oldest son's 2 children, close to 900 acres in the north part of the property, and all of the historic farm complex. So that's owned jointly by those two children, and Philip Augusta and Nina Carroll's other son, John Lee Carroll, and their daughter, Mary Carter Carroll. Between them, I think there were 6 children. I know Carter had 3 daughters, and I think John Lee had a daughter and 2 sons. And the 6 of them owned the acreage south, which again, I guess the total there is probably another 900 acres. But of the 2,400 more or less that my father managed, that included 375 acres on Route 108, between Route 108 and Homewood Road, which had been so badly eroded that my father never tried to even farm it. It was growing up until Philip wanted me to get it back in production again. Right now that's being developed. So of the 2,500 acres, all of it is not still intact, but probably roughly 2,000 of it is still intact, and maybe the grandchildren on the southern part have sold some of it. Most of it is in the county's farmland preservation program, and the program does allow some division and sale into, I think, 50-acre tracts. So some of the southern part may have been sold off. I'm not sure.
Well, so, Bill, when you were little, what did you and your family used to do on a Sunday?
Well, you ask about my father's responsibilities. He was responsible 24/7, but he didn't, most Sundays he didn't actively work, but he was there and responsible. And I do remember that because of the way this farm was run, it was a little more by the clock than the ordinary family farm. When you worked from, you got up at maybe 5 o'clock to milk your cows if it was a dairy farm, and you worked till dark usually, and in the summertime, and the clock didn't mean very much. Well, Duregan Manor, the dairy workers had their responsibilities with the herd, and their workday was probably roughly 10 hours a day. The farm operation and the other employees, such as the beef cattle and the garden, started at 7 and took an hour off for lunch and finished at 6. And then in the wintertime, they not only got Sunday off, they got Saturday afternoon.
So what did you specifically do? Did you have bicycles? Did you play cowboys?
Oh, yeah. Bicycles, yes. Yeah, we all had bicycles. I remember for a while my mother took me to Catonsville to get my hair cut. And I remember some barber saying he couldn't believe that you had a bicycle on a farm. Where do you ride? Well, Manor Lane wasn't paved, but it was pretty solid. And field roads get pretty compacted when it's not raining. And yeah, we rode bicycles. And I wasn't supposed to swim in the Middle Patuxent River. My mother, for whatever reason, my mother didn't want me swimming there, but that didn't mean that we didn't walk the, it would have been about a 2-mile walk from our house to the Middle Patuxent River, where Philip Carroll didn't own the river at that point, but his cousin, the Carrolls that lived on Homewood Road, owned the best swimming spot there. But a bunch of us boys would, maybe we'd hitch a ride with a farm truck that was going south and get a half-mile down the road, and then we had to walk the 1.5 miles and swim in the Middle Patuxent. And there were some kind of fish in another creek on the property then that, you know, before I started working every summer, couple summers we went fishing most days. And again, the Reagan Manor was a unique operation, and after the war, so I'm guessing maybe 1945, Mrs. Carroll, Philip Augusta's wife, started what you might call a summer enrichment program for all the children on the manor, black and white, all the children of the employees from 9 o'clock until 12 o'clock. We had crafts and artwork, working clay, reading improvement. The first teacher was Mary Ann O'Donnell, who then got, after she married, she stopped doing the summer school, but then I thought Mary Ann was first, but maybe one of the Brown sisters, Miss Ruth and Miss Frances Brown. I think that Mrs. Carroll hired her, one of the Brown sisters, to do this the first summer that she ran it, and then Mary Ann did it for several years, and then other people did. And actually, one summer, Charles O'Donnell helped train us boys in carpentry work. And I remember one of the projects was the health department had just bought a building in Ellicott City to make into the health department office, and the summer school made a model of that building to have at the county fair to show that the health department of the county was improving itself by moving into a new office.
Yeah, that office today is Tersicle's restaurant.
Yes, that is correct. Absolutely correct. That was a upgraded health department office.
Beside of Charlie Miller's
Yeah,
dealership.
yeah.
So we pretty much agree that it takes a lot to run a farm as large as 75 people and 2,500 acres.
Yes.
We're going to give your dad a first name because we need to know personally who this man was.
My father was, I'll give his middle name, William Rodenball Powell. He was named for a great uncle of that name, and the Rodenball apparently came from a Methodist minister or a minister of some denomination who the family thought very highly of, was named William Rodenball. So 3 generations back, they named a child William Rodenball Powell. Powell with a single L, incidentally. And but my father never used the second. So he was named for a great uncle, but he was not junior, but they named me the third. So.
Skip the second, huh?
Yeah.
Your dad, how would you describe his management style? I mean, for example, there are a lot of people that manage like they're in the Army and they're running a set of troops underneath of their supervision. What was what did you remember and notice about your father's management style?
Well, I've already said that he was very organized. And I think the Carroll family set the tone of the property. They had an interest in the welfare of the employees, and even though they were wealthy for that period of time, they weren't lavish in their own lifestyle. And I say they set the tone, but I think my father depended very heavily on some very good employees. I mean, I worked at the dairy farm at McDonough School. I worked a year at the University of Maryland Dairy Herd in College Park before it moved to Howard County. And from what I've seen on farms, I would say during the Second World War era and for really the rest of my father's management, he had, I would say, as good a farm crew of workers in the names that I have mentioned that you would find anywhere. And they prided themselves in doing a good job, and they were people with, I think, a moral understanding, and it was just a unique place to grow up and live in that era. And again, I think the Carroll family set the tone. They were concerned about the welfare of their employees and the employees' family. Yes, today you would criticize it as being a little paternalistic, maybe, but my father's, again, management style was to give people the responsibility and provide them with the supplies and the tools to get their job done. I remember I mentioned when from the end of the Second World War, they routinely, a little bit every year, put running water and electricity into all of the remaining tenant houses that didn't have them, and rebuilt one tenant house and replaced one. But they did a lot of that with their own farm labor, trained somebody to have a new skill like block laying, and turn them loose and let them do it. And I think it worked very well for him.
Do you have a favorite piece of equipment you loved operating on the farm?
A bigger piece that I can't say that I do. Yeah.
You were talking about the combine and where the grain came down in two chutes. That's almost a takeoff from the thrashing machine.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, that would be. Yeah, the combine, of course, combined the binder and the thrasher into one machine.
Also, was there ever any mention, perhaps, of employees being Catholic? Because that's what the Carrolls were.
Of the employees being Catholic?
Yeah. It wasn't necessarily a requirement or even a mention. I know a lot of the blacks came to Sunday Mass at the chapel.
Yes.
But I don't remember hardly any of the white employees coming.
No, I just, that was just, I guess, accidental, except the Dutch family, the Van Lieshouts, attended Mass regularly. They were Catholic. But other than them, I do remember for a fair period of time, some of the dairymen would be people who gravitated into Maryland from Tennessee. And the first family I remember were actually two brothers, the Honeycutts. And they were excellent dairymen, but John Honeycutt, Dave Honeycutt, and John Honeycutt. John was a fundamentalist Bible preacher, and he preached somewhere at some church here in the county, and the deal was between the two families they could only afford one car, and Dave had the car, but he and John always worked together because Dave had to drive the car to the church wherever John preached. And the other family I remember was again two different brothers named Cross. Later, after the Honeycutts had moved on to somewhere else, two brothers named Cross were at the Reagan Manor, and they were ahead of a very excellent man, Quentin Tate, who came as herdsman. And again, I think some of these people came through this John L. King Company. My father's tenure at the manor outlived the John L. King Company. The farm management company didn't survive after Mr. King's death, and Mr. King died probably by 1970, and or maybe earlier than that. I'm thinking I should say 1960, because again, in the history of the whole farming operation, after Philip Augusta Carroll died, his son Philip is the one who decided that the manor should bottle and sell their own milk to take advantage of the huge population that was coming in to Columbia and all the rest of the development. And I think, unfortunately, I think we were ahead of our time. I say we, I was running a separate operation, but when the dairy started processing and selling milk, I gave up the separate operation and worked for a salary for Philip Carroll as the farm. I sort of took Harry Affeld's place and ran the farming operation when my father was still taking care of the main dairy and the new bottling and delivery. And they started with home delivery just as home delivery was phasing out. And then they converted to wholesale, but sold at, we had a couple successful stores that Philip Carroll acquired and sold our milk. Principally the one at St. John's Lane and 29 was in a store that was owned by the state roads because it was eventually going to be a big cloverleaf. But they never quite got to the point to compete with Royal Farms or the Wawa stores that so that operation lasted from 1962 to 1973. Philip Carroll closed it after my father retired. I worked with Philip Carroll with the dairy processing operation, the herd, and the farm. And it was during that period, I do want to mention, while we're talking, I think the correct year is 1968. We had a devastating fire on DeRegan Manor. This large bank barn that I referred to that I think would have been built about somewhere around 1910 was not your typical bank barn, had 3 rows of stanchions, and instead of one side of the barn actually being a dirt bank, there was an embankment with a bridge into the top of the barn. The barn was large enough to drive that self-propelled combine up into the top and store it there during the off-season. The manure spreader would go from one end of the barn to the other end with hand cleaning the gutters into a manure spreader. And then there was another 40-cow stanchion barn built about the time my father came to DeRegan Manor, and that's when they milked about 100 Guernseys during the war and after the war. But when Philip decided to go in the milk processing business, they built a whole new dairy housing and milking facility. And again, it was one of the first housing for dairy cattle that we've referred to as freestall barns. That is, there are stalls in the barn, but the cows are not tied up in those stalls. They can go to the feed bunk, they can go to the waterer, and they can go and lie down in these stalls, and they're milked in the milking parlor. And the milking parlor was built adjacent to the milk processing plant. And that operation ran, as again, from I think 1962 to 1973.
Did you ever find the cause for the fire, and what were the results, and how did you rebuild? Did you find the cause, and what were the results, and then how did you rebuild?
Oh, okay. The fire started in the bank barn in August. It was had an awful lot of hay and straw up in the top of the bank barn, and we kept the dry cows we kept only the dry cows in there during the winter. And during the summer, we had some calf pens underneath. Herman Bendig got all the calf pens out after as the fire started, before the collapsed in. So we lost no livestock, but 4 other buildings, all of which had wood shingle roofs, were damaged or totally lost in that fire. It was unbelievable and devastating. The bank barn had a wood shingle roof. That barn itself had more or less outlived its function, but the debris from that fire blowing onto the shingle roofs of 4 other buildings, they took the roof, took only the second floor from the brick workhouse that I referred to, and that was very well rebuilt. The original draft horse stable had been a significant brick building with a wood shingle roof and very unique hand-hewn roof structure, very, very unique in that they used what you would call roof trees to support purlins and the shingle structure. That building was left with just the brick sidewall standing. The granary that had been modernized for mechanical movement of barley and feed supplement into a feed mixing and grinding operation, that was totally destroyed. And a quarter of a mile away, the very old, I'm saying, Revolutionary War era, if not before the Revolutionary War, the riding stable and coach house, and had 6 box stalls, 3 or 4 tie stalls, a coach room, and in it was the convertible and the enclosed coach that had belonged to Governor John Lee Carroll. All of that was totally destroyed because the debris from the fire landed on the wood shingle roof, and the fire companies couldn't get to it fast enough.
Was this barn on the east side of Manor Lane or west side?
Well, it'd be on the east side of Manor Lane.
Now, do we know what caused that fire?
Not really, no. There was we were only putting dry cows underneath for loose housing, so all of the electric wiring that had once lighted up for the milking operation, that had deteriorated somewhat, and so that may have been the cause of it.
Have you been to the Howard County Fair?
Howard County Fair. What year was the first Howard County Fair? 1947 at Brendel's Manor Park. Dick Bendig got myself and a couple of the other farm boys, and we led the show cows the mile from the milking operation to Brendel's Manor Park. Didn't have to put them on a truck.
Yeah, that's true, because you could have went right out Manor Lane, right into Brendel's Manor.
Right straight across the road into the park, tied the cows to ropes between trees, I guess it was. And I was just in 4-H, and I exhibited there, and exhibited every year, pretty near every single year then, until about after we moved to Carroll County. Our children were still in 4-H, and we managed to bring Guernseys to the Howard County Fair probably 1976, 78, but it got to be just too much to keep showing a large number of cows like we did, like Gene Bendig and I did together for many years. But the fair then moved to, went down to Laurel Raceway.
It went to Ellicott City.
Before it went to Ellicott City High School.
Well, it went to Ellicott City twice. It went to Laurel and then
Oh, is that right? Yeah, you have a better record than my memory, but I was at all of them.
But we need your opinion.
Oh, I'll get to that. You never told me how many children you've had.
4.
And what's the mixture?
Pardon?
What is the mixture, boy, girl?
We have a daughter who's now a intensive care pediatrician, and she's a 4-H club leader in Roanoke, Virginia, with 2 daughters in 4-H there. And then we had twins a year and a half younger than Virginia, and they were both dairy science graduates from Virginia Tech, and took over our farming operation and ran it for 16 years. Along with their spouses, after I went to work for the county government. And our youngest daughter is 7 years younger than the oldest, and she is a veterinarian who worked with large animal practice, worked with someone else's large animal practice until after we went out of the dairy business in Carroll County. And now she has a mobile veterinary clinic throughout Carroll County, and has just opened last week a permanent clinic because her mobile practice could not do x-rays and operations. So now she has a clinic with all the modern x-ray and operating facilities to supplement 2 mobile vans. She has another veterinarian working with her now. So,
do you think, Bill, that you might have had an influence on your kids going into farming-related lifestyles?
I'm sorry, with my hearing impairment, I didn't quite catch
Do
it.
you think that you might have had an influence on your children going
Yeah.
into farming-type lifestyles?
Well, I don't think any pressure was put on me was kind of subtle and not real direct, you know. It's just something that I guess as a youngster, growing up the way I did, I felt like that's what I wanted to do, and we really didn't pressure our children or feel that they had to follow in our footsteps. I think it's a mistake to really try. We would not have been disappointed if they had gone into other fields, but it has been rewarding for us, and 5 of our grandchildren that grew up essentially on the farm that we still own. None of them have any inclination to go into farming at this point. 2 are graduating from college this year, but they are not. One's actually in dairy science, but she's hoping to eventually go to medical school.
So let's go back to the last time you were at the Howard County Fair, and you're walking around the fairgrounds. Picture yourself walking around the fairgrounds. You're kind of enjoying it. You're not quite sure where you're going to go next. But a young guy comes up to you and he says, I know you. I was told you were a farmer. I want to go into farming. Do you think I should go into farming?
We'll narrow it down to Howard County.
What, go into farming in Howard County? Of course, farming keeps changing, and Howard County has not done too badly in preserving farmland in their farmland preservation program, but it's all interdispersed with, I think, my feeling, too much residential housing for the kind of commercial farming that existed 50 and 60 and 80 years ago. I think you'd have to find a niche and work with the trend that more people want food produced closer to where they live. And you know, I think it would have to be somebody who is into vegetable or smaller type operations. We don't know what the future will hold, but I wouldn't discourage somebody, but it's tough to get into if you don't have some financial backing.
Very good. Where is your current farm?
Our current farm, our address is Union Bridge, but we are we're on the northern edge of the Union Bridge mailing address. The best description is Uniontown is a small unincorporated village, actually has a historic village designation. It's not very large, and we live between Uniontown and Tawnytown. So,
how big is that farm?
200 acres.
Who's farming it now?
The largest dairy farmer in Carroll County, Cold Spring Farms, Matthew Huff, second, well, he's fifth or more generation of the farm ownership, but his father developed a very outstanding large Holstein herd, Marlin Huff, and Matt Huff needs a lot of land. I don't know whether he's up to 2,000 cows, but he needs a lot of farmland, and that's where Carroll County is now. The large grain farmers need a lot of land to pay for the expensive large equipment, and Matt is no exception. Basically, he only grows corn and soybeans. He's not growing any alfalfa. He does make some grass hay, but he takes care of all of our cropland. Somebody who rents my heifer pastures and just grows Holstein heifers there, so there's no longer any milking. What was a walk-in dairy operation when we went there in 1976 is, of course, now obsolete, even though it was efficient enough then. It's not efficient enough in today's milking, so when our children went out of the dairy business, the facilities had outlived their usefulness, which is usually what happens. I grow 1.5 acres of sweet corn and sell it at the end of the driveway. It gives me a nice retirement income, and I could sell a lot more nice tomatoes than I seem to be able to grow. And I just do it on the honor system, and it keeps me out of trouble.
You've been great to talk to.
If you had onions and green peppers, we could have dinner.
Thanks a million, Bill.
Yeah.